program this morning. I'd like to begin first by saying that I'm going to go through a lot of different protocols for both heifers and cows. There's a lot more detail relative to the data that was generated from the various studies that I'm going to highlight that are included in your proceedings. So for more detailed information on those, I refer you to those proceedings. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the students, both current and former students that have worked in my program at the University of Missouri that have contributed to this work, as well as Dr. Mike Smith, who you just heard from. So in the next 30 minutes, what I'd like to do is provide more or less an overview of protocols specific to heifers, some work that we've done over the last several years focused on 2-year-old cows, then transition into mature cows, and then more or less conclude with some of the recent work that we've done, which was more or less led by Jordan Thomas, who you're going to be hearing from later in the program, referred to as split-time AI. So there's been a lot of work done over the last roughly 20-25 years relative to development of these timed AI protocols, and a lot of that has evolved as a result of some of the things that Dr. Smith talked to you about, as far as our better understanding of how to manipulate the estrous cycles of cows and heifers. And one of the focal points of achieving these goals has been to focus on the 3 points that are highlighted here. They need to be easily scheduled and administered, try and focus on minimizing or reducing the amount of animal handling or the number of times or trips through the chute. But the focus and primary objective of these, because those of you that are old enough as I am to recall some of the early days in terms of protocol development, we were successful in many cases in terms of eliciting an estrus response, but in many cases the pregnancy results were somewhat disappointing. And so there's obviously been a fairly high emphasis on success rates relative to both estrus response and ovulation in terms of pregnancy outcome. So I want to begin with fixed time AI protocols for heifers, and the point that I would refer you to, or this slide that I would refer you to, is a listing of the protocols that are currently recommended for beef heifers. And if you refer to any of the AI stud books, you'll find in the back of each of these books a listing of recommended protocols for both beef heifers and cows. The point that I would refer you to and make sure that you follow or observe when you're referring to these protocols is make sure that you're using the most current year. And as you can see here, these are the recommended protocols for heifers for the current year. But if you refer back or pull a book from 4, 5, 6 years ago, you might be using some outdated information. These protocols are reviewed on an annual basis in our reproductive task force, along with our National Reproduction Leadership Team, which is comprised of representatives from all the AI companies, the pharmaceutical houses, as well as those of us on the academic side, review these, and that's the basis for how these protocols come to be recommended. So I want to begin first with the discussion of the long-term protocols and how they compare in performance relative to heifers. And you already heard about the MGA protocol, which was developed initially at CSU by Ken Odie's group back in the 80s. But it calls for a feeding period of MGA at a dosage of 0.5 milligram per head per day. And the point that I would make there is that intake is the key to success with an MGA-based program. Cattle should be consuming about 0.5 milligram of MGA on a daily basis. It should be fed about the same time every day. I would not recommend top dressing it onto, say for instance, a silage-based ration, but we typically would recommend feeding it in about a 3 to 5 pound carrier. You'll notice the withdrawal period then, or after it's withdrawn from the feed. The recommendation now, based on more recent work from Cliff Lamb and Gene Deitcher at the University of Nebraska, and Cliff, when he was at K-State, calls for an interval of 19 days between MGA withdrawal and prostaglandin. And to contrast that with the cedar, you can see that more or less the cedar goes in on a Monday, 2 weeks later comes out on a Monday, and then there's a reduced interval of 16 days between cedar removal and prostaglandin administration. So we were involved with the development of the cedar-based protocol. And you'll notice that the rationale for the difference in intervals between withdrawal of the progestin and prostaglandin administration is more or less highlighted on this slide. This is heat watch data from heifers coming off either an MGA-based protocol or in the bottom panel, cedar. And what you can see here is that there's distinct differences based on what the heat distribution pattern looks like once you withdraw MGA from the feed versus removal of the cedar. It's all based on physiological clearance and the rate at which that clearance occurs. And what you can see in the case of the cedar, there's a much more robust expression of heat in comparison to the MGA-treated heifers. This is then heat watch data reflecting the distribution of estrus after prostaglandin. The black bars here represent the MGA-treated heifers, the gray bars represent the cedar-treated heifers. And although these heat distribution patterns look very similar, if you run the statistics on this and look at more or less the variance for interval to estrus, and when we run the stats on this, basically the smaller that variance is, it tells us that the synchrony is improved. And there's a statistical or significant advantage to the heifers that were on the cedar-based protocol in comparison to MGA. When you're talking about timed AI with either of these protocols, and Dr. Smith reviewed a bit of this, but with the MGA-based protocol, the recommendation is to perform timed AI at 72 hours after prostaglandin, and at the time of insemination, administer GnRH. And in contrast with the cedar-based protocol, and again, this is based on the degree of synchrony and also the timing of estrus relative to that time frame from when prostaglandin is administered. But you'll see here it's a 66-hour interval in comparison to the 72-hour interval for MGA-treated heifers. Without going through all the data, if you boil it down, and our group was involved with looking at the heat watch data, comparing pregnancy rates of insemination performed on the basis of observed estrus with the aid of heat watch, what we found was that there were no differences in synchronized conception or pregnancy rates between the two protocols. Rick Funston's group at the University of Nebraska then compared the two head-to-head in a fixed time AI setting. And again, in this situation, there was no difference based on how the two protocols performed when compared with one another. The key to MGA, and we've worked with MGA for years, the key to it is intake. And if you cannot assure adequate intake, both in terms of more or less timing and administration, I think you're going to be disappointed with your results. The other point that I would make is that you need to ensure the 0.5 milligram intake per day, and you should see complete heat suppression during the feeding period. You can get into situations where you're getting heat suppression with lower dosages of MGA than the 0.5 milligram, but you may not be getting ovulation control. If that's the case, then you're going to lose a degree of synchrony in relation to the outcome. Want to now transition into the short-term protocols in the multi-state cedar trial that was led by Cliff Lamb. Basically what they did in developing that schedule relative to the short-term protocol is highlighted on this slide. So 4 treatments were compared. The top 2 involve a combination of heat detection followed by more or less an appointment breeding of heifers that did not express estrus up to that time point. But what you can see here is that both involved the 7-day cedar with or without the administration of GnRH and cedar insertion. Prostaglandin was administered on day 7, and then inseminations were performed on the basis of detected estrus up to 84 hours, at which time any of the heifers that did not express estrus were then inseminated and administered GnRH. The bottom 2 panels reflect more or less the same protocol comparison. However, in this case, there was all the heifers were appointment bred at 60 hours and not on the basis of observed heat. There were roughly 500 or 500 plus heifers in each of these 4 treatment groups, so the data were fairly significant relative to the power of the various comparisons. To boil that data down, basically what that data illustrated or pointed to was the fact that GnRH and cedar insertion did not improve pregnancy rates at fixed time AI. GnRH and cedar insertion did not alter the percentage of heifers detected in estrus or that distribution of estrus after prostaglandin, but rather a combination of detecting estrus in AI before cleanup AI actually enhanced pregnancy rates over fixed time AI. The point that I want to make relative to GnRH administration in heifers versus cows is it's much less predictable in terms of the results or outcome you're going to realize from it. In fact, some of the data that's published would indicate that you can see anywhere from 20 to 30% reduction or decreased response rates in heifers in comparison to cows, so it's much less predictable. Want to move down to the 5-day co-sync plus cedar protocol for heifers. And as Dr. Smith pointed out in his presentation, one of the things that you need to understand in comparing the 5-day to the 7-day is what occurs relative to that shortened treatment period in terms of cedar insertion as a result of response to GnRH at the time the cedar is inserted. As he indicated, what will occur in animals that have a follicle or a dominant follicle capable of responding to the GnRH injection is that you'll form what we refer to as an accessory corpus luteum. In a shortened treatment period of 5 days versus the 7, basically what is going to be required to successfully lyse that accessory CL is a second administration of prostaglandin, and as you can see here, the recommendation would be roughly 8 plus or minus 2 hours after the cedar is removed and that initial injection of prostaglandin is given. In this case, timed AI is recommended to be performed at 60 hours after the cedar is removed and that first injection of prostaglandin is given. So when in terms of the published data, looking at comparisons of these protocols head-to-head, the 7 versus the 5-day and the 14 versus the 5-day, basically the only data, although there's numeric differences here, the only data that study that really pointed or highlighted any significant difference between the two protocols was a comparison of the 5 and the 7 with the advantage to the 5-day protocol. And as you can see here, there were over 600 heifers in that study. One of the things that we focus on, we have a large on-farm heifer development marketing program in Missouri. We call the Show Me Select Replacement Heifer Program. And one of the things that I think has occurred over the years, in many cases, heifers were not ready to synchronize. And oftentimes, if that was the case or is the case, the results that occur in terms of AI programs can be somewhat disappointing. So you have to ask, are your heifers ready to synchronize going into the breeding season to set them up for success in terms of pregnancy, both in terms of response as well as pregnancy outcome. What we do know is that heifers that conceive early during their first breeding season tend to stay in the herd longer and produce more pounds of beef over their productive lifetime. And so one of the things that we focus on and actually require in our heifer program is that all heifers are required to go through a pre-breeding exam prior to the initiation of treatments, but also to assess where those heifers are at from a development standpoint in terms of pubertal status. And so that involves evaluation of where those heifers are at in terms of their pre-breeding target weights. All heifers are required to have a reproductive tract score performed, and at the same time, all those heifers are examined in terms of the pelvic areas. We use the tract scores to really define to producers where those heifers are at from a development standpoint in terms of pubertal status. And the scores range from 1 to 5. This scoring system was developed at Colorado State University. And essentially what you can see here in terms of the feedback to producers and helping them understand what these scores translate into is that the score of 1 would indicate that the reproductive tract of the heifer is infantile. And if you get into situations where you get or find very many heifers at tract score 1, that should raise several big red flags. One, perhaps that those heifers are simply too young to fit into the program that you're trying to get them into. Secondly, they may be underdeveloped from a nutritional status. Or thirdly, in some situations, you can run into cases where heifers were implanted during the suckling period, which really can have long-term detrimental effects in terms of reproductive tract development. What those implants do, basically, is permanently disrupt glandular development in the uterus, and those changes or the damage that results basically is irreversible. Scores of 2 would indicate that the heifer is more than a month away from reaching puberty. Scores of 3 would indicate that the heifer is within a month of attaining puberty. And scores of 4 and 5 actually indicate that the heifer's cycling. She has reached puberty, but she's at different stages. Those heifers are at different stages of the estrous cycle. So a 4 would indicate that the heifer is in the follicular phase of her cycle, as Dr. Smith described, whereas a 5 would indicate that that heifer actually has a palpable corpus luteum and is somewhere between day 6 and 16 of the cycle. These exams are performed in our state by all veterinarians across the state and basically are determined on the basis of palpable structures on the ovaries as well as uterine horn uterine horn diameter and tone. So timing is a big deal when these tract scores are actually performed. You can get into the heifer simply too early, which if that's the case, the results are going to be somewhat meaningless. So our recommendation would be to time them 4 to 6 weeks before breeding or 2 weeks before a synchronization program, depending upon the program that you're using. And based on the thousands of records that we have in our database, our recommendation would be that groups of heifers, if they're going on a progestin-based protocol, are ready to synchronize if at least half of those heifers track score 4 or 5 at the time of the exam. So I want to share with you some field data from Missouri, because all of the data flows into our system, so it really gives us an opportunity to assess how these protocols are working in the field. So this is data on 35,000 heifers collected at the, through the Show Me Select program in Missouri. All of these heifers were track scored, and all of these heifers then, these 35,000 plus heifers were all exposed for one appointment breeding at the beginning of the breeding season. What you can see here is that, to begin with, that first row of numbers indicates the number of heifers that were pregnant. The second row indicates the number that were actually exposed, that were assigned the various track scores. And then the third row of numbers indicates the actual time day out preg rates. You should notice the abysmal results among those heifers that track score 1. And so based in our program now, most of the heifers that track score 1 in our system, most of those heifers never see the breeding season. Most of those heifers will either go to a feed yard or to a sale barn. Scores of 2, you can see there that the time day out preg rates on those heifers was 28%. You jump to 48% for the 3s, and then 51 and 52% for the heifers that were actually cycling. Understand that we do have differences relative to season, because we have both fall and spring breeding seasons. We have differences relative to sires that are used in these programs, technicians, and then various differences relative to the management of these various farms. We then broke the data down based on the specific protocols that were used. And what's highlighted here, the 3 protocols that are being used on heifers in the program, with the 7-day co-sync cedar, MGA prostaglandin, and the 14-day cedar. I highlight here the heifers that we eliminated the 1s from this grouping, and highlight only the non-cycling heifers that were assigned scores of 2 and 3. And what you can see here is that there were 466 heifers on the 7-day co-sync cedar. 37% of those heifers that were determined to be non-cycling at the time the exams were performed, conceived to the time day high. 35% of the 230 MGA prostaglandin treated heifers, and of the over 10,000 heifers on the 14-day cedar, 46% of those heifers became pregnant to the time day high. If we jump to the cycling heifers, you can see there 44, 47, and 52% for the 7-day co-sync cedar treated heifers, the MGA prostaglandin group, and the 14-day cedar treated heifers. But when you combine those, and that's the point that Dr. Smith made in his presentation, is that in any of your systems, you're going to be working with both cycling and non-cycling females when these treatments are imposed and going into the breeding season. And when you combine these numbers then of the 1,400 heifers that were on the 7-day co-sync cedar, 42% of those became pregnant, 44% of the 800 on the MGA prostaglandin protocol, and the almost 33,000 on the 14-day cedar, half of those became pregnant. So basically, any of these percentages with different superscripts after them indicate that they are significantly different from one another. And what you can see here is that despite the lower numbers in the 7-day group and the MGA group, the statistics would indicate that there is an advantage to the longer-term cedar-based protocol. The reason we're seeing so much use of that protocol in the state is being driven in large part by our veterinarian community. And the reason for that is that it's more or less a one-stop shop. Pre-breeding booster vaccinations can be administered at the time the cedars go in. The track scores and pelvics can be done on the heifers at that time. And the veterinarians in our state are becoming much more involved with the reproductive management of these herds, which I think in the long term is going to pay big dividends, both in terms of the farms and ranches they work with, as well as those individual veterinary practices. So some take-home points for heifers: the protocols work. Choosing a protocol for heifers, I think, really should be based on determination of the cyclicity status of those heifers, and then use that information to choose a protocol that may work best in your system. And as Dr. Smith indicated, protocol compliance is and will continue to be a big determinant of success, both in terms of product administration and timing of insemination. So I want to transition now to 2-year-olds. And 2-year-olds historically have been a problem group of females in many breeding programs. And so we were interested in, because of the differences in terms of how these protocols work, short versus long term, we were curious as to whether or not we could see differences or perhaps an advantage to a longer-based protocol specifically in 2 years, because 2-year-old females, specifically because in most cases, though the return to estrus or the length of that anestrus period in those younger age females is complicated, perhaps more so than in mature age cows. So a former graduate student of mine, Jill Abel, led this project, and basically it was a fairly simply designed experiment. We compared the 14-day cedar to the 7-day co-synch cedar protocol. And the point that I want to highlight here in terms of differences, if you're thinking about using this the longer-term protocol in cows versus heifers, is that interval between prostaglandin and appointment breeding should be 72 hours versus 66 hours in heifers. And what that protocol was compared to was a 7-day co-synch cedar treated group, in which case AI was performed at 66 hours. We conducted this just having an opportunity to access large groups of 2-year-olds at a single location. We worked with our university herd at the Thompson Research Center in Missouri, but then worked with 2 large ranches in southwestern Montana, both in Deer Lodge and in Dillon. So to boil some of this data down, one of the things, and we got into a discussion of this last night to a certain extent, but one of the things, if you use the 14-day cedar in cows versus heifers, you'll see a significant reduction in heat response up to the point of time to AI. And this can be alarming in some cases to the point of really low heat expression. So what you can see if you compare those 2 protocols in terms of the totals, shown there at the bottom, 43% of the 355 2-year-olds on the 14-day protocol had exhibited estrus up to the point of time to AI, compared to 74% of those on the 7-day treatment. If you look at the pregnancy rates, however, and this is really one of the only data sets that really sort of differs in terms of the significance of heat expression as it relates to fertility. The pregnancy rates were essentially identical. 63% of those females on the 14-day treatment became pregnant versus 64% on the 7-day co-synch cedar. And if you look at the performance of these females, both in terms of the time to AI results as well as the pregnancy rates within the first 30 days of the breeding season, 87 and 88% were pregnant within the first 30 days, and 95 and 96% became pregnant by the end of the 60-day breeding season. The point that I want to make is these were extremely well-managed herds, and in all of these cases, all of those 2-year-olds had been synchronized as yearling heifers, and they had been calved in a fairly synchronized calving period during that first calving season. The point that I want to make relative to this is that the protocols are very effective, and despite the differences relative to heat expression, in our opinion, basically, obviously, they perform very similarly. How do we explain the differences relative to fertility in the face of low heat expression? I don't have that slide here, but it's in the proceedings paper. But essentially, on a subsample of females that were involved in this study, we looked at estradiol concentrations at the time of AI between the 2 treatments, and essentially, estradiol concentrations on the 14-day cedar-treated heifers in the absence or the reduced rate of estrus expression were 2-fold greater than those females that were on the 7 days. So it really helped us, going back to what Dr. Smith talked about in terms of the significance of estradiol in terms of fertility outcomes. It really helped us explain some of that data. I want to move now to time to AI protocols for cows, and this is a question that I think a lot of people have. And this is a study that Dan Bush, who's now with Select Sires, led. And I use this because a lot of people get, as far as I'm concerned, sloppy in terms of thinking about using or administering these protocols. And this data set really highlights how important timing really is. When the first protocol sheets came out, the recommendation was to really consider using that time frame as wide as from 54 to 66 hours to appointment breed cattle. Specifically cows. In our opinion, 54 was essentially too early because of the lower heat response. So Dan really led this trial, and essentially what we saw was, in terms of the treatment comparisons, was fairly simple. All the cows were assigned to the same protocol, simply differed relative to when inseminations were performed. There were over 800 cows involved in this study, and what you can see from this is the pregnancy rates were acceptable and very good by most standards among cows assigned to the two treatments. So of the 400 cows in the 54-hour group, 61% of those became pregnant, and of the cows that were assigned to the 66-hour group, 67% of those cows became pregnant. But do note that those differences are significantly different from one another, or biologically different based on the statistics that were run. So what we do in our studies, when I talk to a group of producers like yourselves, I want to be able to say with some degree of confidence that the 54-hour cows were actually bred or inseminated at 54 versus a later or earlier time frame, and the same relative to the 66 hours. So basically what we do is, for all the cows that are on these trials or heifers, we record the injection time on at which time prostaglandin is administered, and then we also record the corresponding time of insemination. What you can see here is that the cows that were assigned to the 54-hour group, the mean time of insemination was 54.2 hours compared to 66.2 for the cows in the 66-hour group. Cows at one of those locations, actually, we had the luxury of using heat watch on to really evaluate heat response up to the point of time to die, and look at that in relation to pregnancy outcome. And so what you can see here is that among the cows in the 54-hour group, only 26% of those cows had exhibited estrus by 54 hours. In contrast to that, to the fact that half of the cows in the 66-hour group had exhibited estrus. This is where the data gets interesting. And if you look at the pregnancy rates here based on estrus response at time of AI, if you look at the cows that exhibited estrus in the 54-hour group, and admittedly there were lower numbers there, the pregnancy rates on those cows that exhibited estrus was 65%. But by waiting to 66 hours, look at what the pregnancy rate was on those cows. 81% of those cows conceived at the time to AI, compared to 65% of the cows that were inseminated that had exhibited estrus at 54 hours. Among the cows that did not exhibit estrus, you don't see those dramatic differences. So in summary from that, more cows exhibited estrus prior to time to AI when AI was performed at 66 compared to 54 hours, and cows that exhibited estrus prior to time to AI had higher pregnancy rates than cows that did not. I want to compare now the two protocols that are recommended for cows. I'm not going to talk about Bos indica, as Jordan Thomas is going to review some of that information with you, but this is primarily, in most cases, the data that's generated from the comparison of these two protocols has been in Bos taurus. And so when you put the two protocols together head to head and look at the outcomes that result from it, basically work that was done in our program at Missouri, Dallas Wilson, one of my former graduate students was involved with that project. The results from Dallas's work are shown and highlighted by the blue, the rows that are highlighted in blue, and then work from Virginia Tech is highlighted in the sort of salmon colored rows. And what you can see from Dallas's study with a little over 200 cows per treatment, the pregnancy rates were identical comparing the 5 versus the 7 day. And in the work from Virginia Tech with much larger numbers, over 900 cows per treatment, basically there was a 3 percentage point advantage to the cows that were assigned to the 5 day protocol. The point that I would draw your attention to, though, is in the cows that were in the 7 day treated group, those cows were inseminated on average at 69 hours versus 66. As part of a USDA grant, one of the things we did with one of the integrated grants that we received is my students and then Dr. Smith were involved with more or less taking the show on the road. And we worked with herds that are highlighted on this slide. And Dan Bush, again, when he was with us as a research specialist in my program, basically led this effort, which was no small undertaking. But we worked with 73 herds in Missouri, inseminated over 7,000 cows, and all the cows were on the 7 day co-sync plus cedar protocol. And our timed AI pregnancy rate for those 73 herds and 7,000 cows was average 62%. 7 of the herds were under 50%, and I think without exception, Dan and I could probably go through each one of those and identify or point to factors that contributed to that. But this really opened people's eyes as to how the protocols might work, or how this protocol might work, and how it might facilitate expanded use of timed AI across the state. If you look at the data in terms of the comparisons of the 5 versus the 7, and again, this is from field data in Missouri, 62% of those cows, as I indicated, became pregnant. And then Sandy Johnson several years ago compiled a lot of the data on the 5-day treated cows from the published literature, essentially with over 2,000 cows. Basically, the pregnancy rates were very comparable. So, some take-home points for cows when considering a choice between the 5 and 7-day protocols. Both protocols work effectively, but there is evidence that there may be a slight advantage to the 5 over the 7-day from the work from Virginia Tech. But I think one of the things you need to take into consideration is the differences in terms of inputs that are required for the 5-day and the extra animal handling. So some take-home points there. The protocols do work. Choosing the protocol for time AI in cows should involve consideration of the cow's age, average number of days postpartum, and body condition. And then again, one of the things that I want to highlight here is compliance, both in terms of product administration and timing of insemination. And one of the problems that we're seeing, all of us that work in these areas across the country, we're getting calls, more calls now from producers than you would expect as to, I gave prostaglandin on the day I should have given GnRH or vice versa. And if you get into a situation like that, you probably ought to give one of us a call to kind of help lead you through how to perhaps fix that. So I want to conclude with some more recent work that Dr. Jordan Thomas led when he was a student in our program. And it's this whole concept of split-time AI. And this was initially begun with the intent of trying to improve pregnancy rates using sex-sorted semen and more or less the development of a new breeding strategy that perhaps would facilitate that. And it was a consideration that involved somewhat of a modified approach to fixed-time AI with the idea that could male fertility be optimized by differentially managing females based on estrus expression prior to timed AI, and could fertility be improved by splitting AI time for both estrus and non-estrus females. The initial work that Jordan did with this was, in terms of the experimental aim, was more or less the development of a strategy that would optimize fertility by better managing females that don't express estrus prior to time AI. And the idea here was, or the hypothesis behind these original studies, was that delaying insemination of those non-estrus females at the appointed time might perhaps improve results that we observed in terms of using that split-time AI approach. One of the things that's a key component of using this, and I would recommend it in many cases even if you're not using split-time AI, because it gives you a really good indication of what your cyclicity status going into the timed AI period is the use of these estrus detection aids or estrotechs. Basically, in all the work that Jordan did, and essentially all the work that we now do in our program, estrotechs are used routinely and administered at the time prostaglandin is administered. Without going into the results, basically what we saw from the initial studies, or what Jordan saw from the initial studies, was that split-time AI increased pregnancy rates by 34% among non-estrus cows that were inseminated with sex-sorted semen. Split-time AI increased pregnancy rates by 15% among non-estrus heifers using conventional semen. But from those initial studies, there was no significant improvement in pregnancy rates with split-time AI using conventional semen in non-estrus cows. So that series of studies was then followed by another series of studies that Brianne Bishop, who's now practicing BBM in Missouri, led, looking at timing of GnRH administration in relation to this whole split-time AI concept. And again, without taking time, because I don't have the time to really go through the data, when considering split-time AI from Brianne's work, basically what she found was that it's not necessary to administer GnRH to cows or heifers that express estrus up to 66 or 90 hours after prostaglandin. In this case, using either the 14-day CEDAR in heifers or the 7-day co-sync CEDAR in cows. And that GnRH may be administered concurrent with AI for heifers or cows that fail to express estrus prior to 90 hours. So let me show you what that looks like. So in the case of the panel at the top, that illustrates what we're currently recommending in terms of the 14-day CEDAR treated heifers. So essentially, estrotechs go on at the time prostaglandin is administered. And then at the appointed time at 66 hours, estrus heifers are all inseminated and no GnRH is administered. Any of the non-estrus heifers at that time do not receive GnRH, but they're held for 24 hours. So think about this. If you give prostaglandin on a Monday at 2 o'clock, Thursday morning, those heifers that are estrus would be inseminated at 8 a.m. in the morning. Any of the non-estrus heifers would be held over till Friday morning, in which case all the estrus heifers are inseminated, but the only heifers that receive GnRH are the heifers that remain non-estrus at that time point. The same applies to the 7-day co-sync cedar-treated cows, in which case you can see here, insemination of the estrus cows is performed at 66 hours. The non-estrus cow, all the remaining cows are held 24 hours, and only those cows that have failed to exhibit estrus receive GnRH at that time. There's a poster out in the hallway that we just concluded. Emma Nickmeyer, who's a current student of mine, completed with the MJ prostaglandin protocol, and she's in the process of summarizing data from the 7-day co-sync cedar protocol. But basically what Emma's data shows with respect to the MJ prostaglandin protocol is that we're also seeing a significant improvement in pregnancy outcome by using this split time approach with the 14-day MGA prostaglandin program. So where do we go from here in terms of future research? I think you're going to see continued development and evaluation of protocols to expand opportunities to utilize timed AR, split time AI in Bos indicus females. And Jordan will talk a little bit about this as well as other speakers over the course of the program. I think you're going to also see continued interest in development of breeding strategies that facilitate use of sex-sorted semen. Our group in Missouri is interested in trying to facilitate improvements as a result of that, because I think the industry is going to expect that those breeding strategies actually evolve. And then also to begin efforts to elicit differences among bulls on the basis of how those various bulls may perform in programs that require or demand fixed time AI or even split time AI. So I want to conclude by a lot of the work that's here and a lot of the protocols all the protocols that are on the protocol sheets would not be there without input from the Beef Reproduction Task Force and the leadership team. A lot of our work over the years has been funded by USDA's Competitive Grants Program. I want to thank all the industry partners that have supported this work over the years. We couldn't have done what we've done without their support. And then a lot of the cooperators that have contributed to this work. And I also want to highlight and thank a person who's not able to be at this conference. We lost him this last summer, Sam Mock, and he was a big contributor to everything we've done. So with that, I'd like to thank you and appreciate your attention. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but we do. Okay.